Welcome to the fifth and final day of the 2023 Covering Rare Diseases Journalism Fellowship. For our first session, many of the conversations over the past 4 days have led us to one inescapable conclusion. Until equity and access are part of the rare disease research, treatment, and advocacy equation, the full impact of what is possible for rare disease patients and families will not be achieved. Researchers like our first speakers today are analyzing a central focus of that equation, which is how to make clinical trials more inclusive. We're joined by Andrea Thoumi. She's a health policy researcher with over 15 years of experience focused on reducing health inequities through health policy, health financing, and community health. Currently, she is the Community Health and Equity Area Lead and the Faculty Director of Health Equity Education, as well as a core faculty member and adjunct assistant professor at the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy. She is also a consulting associate with the Duke University Department of Family Medicine and Community Health. Andrea is joined by two colleagues. First, Sandra Yankah is a postdoctoral research associate at the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy. She contributes her expertise to projects dedicated to advancing health equity, enhancing health systems, and delving into the ethical considerations at the intersection of health policy and biomedical innovation. And finally, Trevan Locke is an assistant research director at Duke-Margolis, working on issues related to biomedical innovation. He oversees Duke-Margolis' involvement as a founding member of the Advancing Clinical Trials at the Point of Care Coalition and work streams on evidence generation for Duke-Margolis' real-world evidence collaborative. You can read their full and impressive bios on our website at nationalpress.org. Andrea, Sandra, and Trevan, thank you so much for joining us at the Covering Rare Diseases Fellowship Program today. Andrea, why don't you take it away? I know that you prepared a presentation for us, so I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. And Rachel, thanks so much for the warm welcome, and thank you everyone for letting us join your session today. So let me just get this going. All right. So as Rachel noted, I'm here today with two of my colleagues, Sandra and Trevan. A lot of the work that we do at Margolis is collaborative, and while I am the area lead for health equity at the center, I wanted to make sure that we had the rest of our expertise noted here. So again, here are just Sandra and Trevan. I did want to start with a statement of independence. So the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy is part of Duke University and honors the tradition of academic independence as part of its faculty and scholars. And neither Duke nor Margolis take partisan positions, but the individual members are free to speak and express our opinions regarding important issues. And here are just some the background that Rachel already provided. So I wanted to, before diving into the actual content for today, just to provide a little bit more background on Margolis itself. So here, just laying out some of Duke-Margolis' goals. So we're a center that is now we've been at Duke for about 8 years now. We analyze and formulate health policies to be able to further advance evidence-based, actionable, and effective solutions in 3 core areas. So the first area is around healthcare transformation. So this is focused on care delivery and payment reform efforts to make health more accessible, affordable, and equitable, and really focused on delivering higher quality and value. The second key area is biomedical innovation. So this is around improving how drugs, devices, diagnostics, and medical services are developed paid for and used. So both Sandra and Trevan sit on the biomedical innovation team. So we're very lucky to have them today. And then the third key pillar in the center is around education. So we have a whole series of programs focused on educating the next generation of healthcare leaders, which includes multidisciplinary students, both from undergrad, graduate programs at Duke, as well as postdoctoral fellows like Sandra and others. So just diving in a little bit more here, we also, in addition to these three focus areas, we have a number of cross-cutting themes that go across these three pillars. So the first one is around looking at the 21st century public and population health. The second key area is the area that I lead around health equity, and then the third key area is around global health. So what we thought we would do today is to cover these three key objectives. The first one will be around defining the concepts of health equity, structural inequity, and how they apply to clinical trial representation. I should note, I see a lot of folks from around the world here today. Today's conversation is going to be focused on the applications to U.S. clinical trials, but a lot of these principles could be applied globally as well. The second key objective is to examine the current clinical trial landscape, again, in the U.S., including individual and structural barriers to representation. And then the third area is around discussing key lessons and starting points for meaningful change. And this is based on work that the three of us have conducted over the last year in this area. So first, I will start going over some of the key terms and concepts, and please feel free to ask any questions. But I know that we will have time afterwards as well to dive into conversation. So the next couple of slides are really focused on some of the key differences in terminology with regard to equity, equality, justice, and inequality. So we've, all of these terms have been shared a lot, particularly in recent years, but I did want to point to the difference between equity and equality in particular. So, and the reason why this is important is because the framing then leads to different responses or interventions. So with regards to equality, that really is referring to providing the same resources regardless of opportunity, whereas equity is getting at the structural differences in opportunity, the structural differences in access that then lead to differences in outcomes, whether that's health outcomes or other outcomes. So one example that I wanted to walk through today was actually in the US, we had the COVID-19 vaccination cutoff, the age cutoff, which was 65 plus. So this type of measure would be considered an equality measure, not necessarily an equity measure. And that's because it was, one age cutoff, regardless of the differences in mortality, risk of exposure, pre-existing differences in life expectancy among different population groups. So a number of health equity scholars did raise this point. So a more equitable intervention would have been changing, or rather adjusting the age cutoffs based on these other factors. So for example, with Black Americans, where Black Americans experience a lower life expectancy, and this has been well documented in the literature and various studies, that then a lower age cutoff would have been a more equitable solution for Black populations. There were a couple of states actually in the US that did this for Native American populations, where the age cutoff was 50 for Native American population. So again, this is just trying to tease out the differences between an intervention that is focused more on equality, which again, that would mean you're providing the same resources without accounting for these differences, whereas equity, you are building in the differences in opportunity and measured through various factors. Here we have also just an overview of social determinants of health. I'm sure many of you have already seen a lot of this. So as we know in health, the majority of the factors that actually lead into someone's health are something called social determinants of health. I would posit too that this includes there's been a push in the equity world now to include things like political determinants of health. So that's also another way of describing these factors. But the conventional social determinants of health include economic stability, neighborhood and physical environment, education, food, community and social context, and healthcare system. I don't have a slide here on what the WHO has conceptualized as social determinants of health, but that's also another really fantastic resource. The WHO came out with a framework that lays out both intermediary determinants of health and also more direct determinants of health that that was developed with a global mind or a global perspective in nature. So I would highly recommend that resource. But I wanted to walk through how some of these determinants of health result in inequitable trial access. So for example, in the United States, and I'm sure in many of your home countries as well, there are differences in access to healthcare based on one's documentation status. So if one is an immigrant, for example, in the US, your documentation status will have an effect on whether you are able to access various health insurance, whether that is private health insurance or the Medicare or Medicaid health insurance programs. And so this has effects too, not just on the individual that may lack that documentation status, but also on the families that may have a mixed immigration status, meaning that one family member has one type of documentation status and another family member may have a more formal documentation status. Another key social determinant of health that we see is around the overrepresentation of historically marginalized populations in low-wage jobs that then requires someone to have multiple jobs that then can make it a challenge for them to participate in trials for various reasons. One, they might not be able to go to the trial site because of their job. They might not have sufficient funds to make it there. And for many people working in low-wage jobs in the U.S., they're working on a daily wage, and so then having to go to a trial without fair compensation then would affect that representation. Other elements here too include differences in various geographic areas with regard to having lower bandwidth access, which then would affect any digital health services, access to a computer, and then also differences in access to pharmacies or grocery stores, where then you would be able to seek any pharmaceuticals that one might need. There's also varying degrees in health literacy as well as digital literacy. So all of these factors may come in as someone is, reading through the documentation for a clinical trial and the paperwork that one has to fill out. And then there's also experiences of discrimination in the health system and other sectors that has led to warranted mistrust and low trustworthiness of health systems. And by this, we mean that the health systems themselves need to be working through increasing the trustworthiness of their services to engage population groups that have been historically marginalized. And lastly, we also see insufficient language equity or payment systems that support language equity. So by this, we mean lack of translation, lack of materials that are translated, or lack of personnel in the clinical trials that would be able to communicate in the preferred language of the individual. So here is a definition of structural inequities as well. Just wanted to delve through this a little bit further. So health, and this is from the National Academy of Medicine's Communities in Action report, which was published a number of years ago. So the two key points that I wanted to raise here is that health inequities are really about the distribution of power and resources. So again, as I mentioned earlier, differences in terms of opportunity, but this really does focus on the distribution of power, and then this unequal allocation of power and resources, which then leads to these differences in outcomes that we see. One structural inequity that I wanted to highlight, this is from data from Durham, North Carolina in July of 2020. So this is a map that shows the geographic distribution of COVID testing sites in Durham. And so again, this type of structural inequity is something that we would see replicated in clinical trials as well. So where the way Durham is set up, the areas that were majority, or that where residents are majority white had a higher number of testing sites, whereas the neighborhoods that are predominantly Black and Latino had lower testing sites. Again, this was in July of 2020. Some of this did change, but this is just a visual illustrating the way that these types of sites can be inaccessible. And a key point here too is, even if in the neighborhoods where there was access to sites, having a physical site that is available does not mean that that site actually is accessible to population groups, to populations that live there. And we saw this during the pandemic, where a lot of localities then expanded testing sites in neighborhoods that were predominantly comprised of historically marginalized populations. However, even though these sites were available in those neighborhoods, it did not translate to people that were living in those neighborhoods actually being able to access those sites. So just taking this one step further in terms of inaccessible clinical trials themselves, I did want to highlight, there is this term that I'm sure many of you have heard at some point, hard to reach. This type of wording places the onus on communities rather than on the decision makers, providers, and researchers to make clinical trials equitable and accessible. So as we're framing and talking about populations who are not able currently to either access clinical trials or are not engaged in clinical trials, the wording and language around how we're framing this is very important. So for example, rather than saying hard to reach, it would be that the services are hard to reach rather than the individuals or population groups themselves. And so, pushing this a little bit further, it's really about the clinical research infrastructure having the responsibility to create accessible opportunities for all populations, again, accounting for the differences in resources and power and opportunities to receive the benefits of the clinical trial sites. And then lastly, I wanted to touch a little bit on community engagement in clinical trials, which my colleagues are going to expand on a little bit further. But I wanted to introduce this framework around community engagement, and this lays out. This is from the CDC in the U.S., and this lays out the types of community engagement that one engages in. So the work on the left hand of the screen, so outreach and consultation, are really foundational but preliminary steps in community engagement, whereas a goal should be to actually lead more towards the right side of the screen, which is collaboration and shared leadership, which really gets at having strong bidirectional relationships, having decision-making power that is distributed across community members, having strong partnerships, et cetera. So again, when you hear the word community engagement, that will touch on all of these factors. but the goal is really to go towards shared leadership. And so a couple of points I wanted to highlight. I actually recently published a new article in AJPH that's on training community health workers as clinical research navigators, as well as healthcare system navigators. But a few key points I wanted to raise here is that one is around embedding community health workers with bicultural and community expertise in clinical trials is one solution. And then also having a community-informed co-development process to ensure that community voices are included in research direction and trust building of any clinical trial. So by this, it would be, conducting focus groups, working with community members to really co-develop this process. And I'm happy to share the resource with Rachel, though we have a slide at the end where we have all of our resources there as well. And so I'm going to hand it over now. Let's see, one more slide on this. So the importance of community engagement and trust building. Community engagement is integral to acknowledging and intervening on systemic and structural contributions to poor trial representation. And so again, focus more on this shared leadership model. I'll also provide some additional resources outside of my Duke appointment. I'm also an executive team member of a coalition of partners called Latin 19, where we have focused on community engagement and embedding community voices of the Latino populations in North Carolina. And so I will share that information. But community engagement does have to be approached as genuine and authentic and really building relationships, not just in a transactional way, so not just for the purposes of research, but really identifying, what are those meaningful efforts to engage community members, both within the trial activities, but also outside of the trial activities themselves. And then lastly, to sustain these efforts, the creation of incentives that encourage community relationships are needed, because currently a lot of this work is not paid for, or if it is covered through grants or projects, often it's not the focus of that grant itself. Okay. So I'm now going to hand it over to my colleague Trevan to take it over on providing an overview of the clinical trial landscape.
Thanks so much, Andrea. It's likewise great to be here with you all. I'm going to provide, as Andrea said, a bit of overview of where clinical trials currently are and what we've been working on at Margolis in this space of improving clinical trial representation. So next slide, starting here with kind of a basic, here's what clinical trial enterprise typically is described as, starting with preclinical testing into the 3 phases that go through safety, efficacy, and randomized studies to evaluate a new therapy, and then kind of post-market considerations after that. I should note this is kind of the typical description of clinical research. It looks a bit different often in rare diseases where you have a smaller number of patients. You might not see a trial hitting, the hundreds of digits, much less the thousands of digits. Though they're often a lot smaller, particularly the early trials, and you can, see in several cases, phase 2 trials being used for the initial approval from regulatory agencies under kind of accelerated or conditional approval settings, depending on which regulator you're working with, where they want to get a therapy out to patients quickly based off of a kind of intermediate endpoint, but plan for continued studies to confirm benefit down the line. Next slide. So quickly, before diving into some of the more representation and inclusion considerations, just wanted to quickly describe what we've been thinking a lot about at Margolis, and many others in the States and globally are part of this conversation too, on how we can refine the evidence generation system that I kind of just described on the last slide, particularly in the post-market setting, so that we can learn how to best use certain therapies in the real world. I'll dig into this a little bit more in later slides, but clinical trials are often, younger, healthier participants compared to what you might see in the real world, just because of the way eligibility criteria work, and sponsors wanting to make sure that they're, especially in early trials, evaluating what's actually happening with the therapy and not introducing factors that might confound or confuse the results. But what we've been thinking about here at Margolis is a concept we call point of care trials. And so this slide here kind of describes the continuum. On the left hand, traditional trials is kind of what I just described, the 3 phases, usually in specialized centers, not many locations, so it's limited access. They can accommodate more complex approaches, but again, there's limitations on really who has good access to this. And on the other side is these point of care trials, where we're trying to set up these trials ideally integrated, where patients receive their normal care. So local doctor's office, local clinics, leveraging integration with the health records that pretty much everyone is using these days to enroll patients, randomize them, collect the data, and support streamlined approaches for evidence generation. There are some limits here. You can't answer as complex questions, but you can reach more people. And I'll talk about what that means a little bit more in the later slides. Next slide. So regardless of what trials we're talking about, whether traditional, small, large, point of care, many are affected by some of the structural and systemic complexities that Andrea touched on a little bit, that can ultimately result in the failure to address important research questions quickly, equitably, and efficiently. There's a growing evidence to reimagine trial conduct to improve representation while not compromising vital research standards. Without that accurate representation, it is difficult to generate generalizable clinical research findings. Again, as I said, trials are often not reflective of real world populations, and so there's a lot of things we can do to improve that. And ultimately, representative trials are good science. You want to make sure that doctors know from the trials that are happening that how a drug would be best used kind of across the board, not in the curated trial population. So this good science contributes to the development of clinically meaningful medical products and ultimately patient acceptability of new products upon approval. It's common sense that doctors and their patients want to know that a new drug was tested in populations like them before deciding whether or not it's right in any individual case. But too often we have not had that kind of paradigm, and decision making has been more tricky. Next slide. I should say the goal here is not diversity targets for the sake of diversity targets. We're not just trying to hit kind of predefined goals based off census or anything like that. But again, other ensuring that trials are truly representative of the real disease burden. This encompasses not just race and ethnicity, but also geography. Too many trials are conducted in specialized centers that many people don't have access to. Age, again, trial populations tend to be younger than the typical population of diseases being studied. Socioeconomic status, the social determinants of health that Andrea mentioned, as well as sexual orientation and gender identity. And equitable research infrastructure would be comprised of trials and studies that accurately match the demographics of the disease burden under study. Although it should be said that this is not always easy. Because of some of the barriers that Andrea mentioned, we don't always know what the actual disease burden looks like, because some populations may not have enough access to care for us to know that a given disease is more prevalent in one population over another. So there's a need here for better data across the board that enables us to accurately build trials around the disease prevalence, whether it's more prevalent in a certain genetic ancestry or in a certain geographic area or in older patients or what have you. We need good data to make sure we can do that, and then we need to make sure the trials we're designing take that into account. Next slide. So what does not getting this right mean? So based off some data from FDA a few years ago, Despite this being a conversation topic for decades now in the States, 75% of trial participants were non-white Hispanic. So that number should be in the States closer to 60%. So you can see there's still quite a big gulf, big gap in what we're doing and where we should be. More recent report last year from the National Academies showed little progress in improving that, particularly in racial and ethnic patient populations in the U.S. Likewise, there are continued challenges in geographic, socioeconomic, age, and gender representation in clinical research. Gender has seen much more improvement in some of these other areas due to earlier pushes in the 90s, but still not quite where it probably should be, I think, based off the latest data. One economic model that was, I think, conducted in conjunction or with the Academy's report suggests that if we address just a little bit of the health disparity in trials here by improving representation, that there could be potentially billions of economic gains based from common chronic diseases like diabetes and heart disease, driven by opportunities to address reduced life expectancy, shorten disability-free lives, and help people be in the working population longer by having better access to care. And obviously, this is an economic analysis, but I think important to point out that what we're really talking about here is improving access to clinical trial opportunities can ultimately close persistent gaps in life expectancy between different populations by leading to better care. And that's great not only for, obviously just having healthier populations and better care, but there are other economic benefits and such as well that might drive incentivization from certain stakeholders in the space. Next slide. Coming back to point of care trials. So as I said, we see these kind of in the post-market setting, helping us evaluate therapies in the real world to see how best to give them and improve care outcomes. We think they also provide a means to address some of the barriers that we've touched on towards low representation and building more power to detect subgroup effects in clinical trials by providing increased access where people already receive care and ultimately lower cost to conduct trials and enable larger trial sizes in trials that might otherwise be have a hard time recruiting. So for rare diseases, this probably looks like long-term follow-up of therapies in the post-market to see if there's any side effects or changes in efficacy over time. It might also look like improvements in dosing or how to deliver the therapy in a broader range of populations and in more places. We think point of care trials have the potential to simplify trial conduct, increase evidence in certain groups, and as I said, increase access for rural populations, and help build a more sustainable trial infrastructure, not a single-use infrastructure, which is all too common these days, where a trial might come in, operate for a few months or a year or whatever, and then leave nothing behind for our population to use for additional trials. And just a quick note here, infrastructure is improving to engage people in clinical research where they receive their usual care, with a growing number across the globe of countries across the globe taking efforts to improve evidence generation at the point of care through various means. Next slide. Just a few more notes on what people are doing here to try to improve. So you may be familiar with recent legislation passed here in the States at the end of last year that gives the FDA new authority to require diversity action plans from drug sponsors for their trials. So these plans are essentially something that sponsors will soon have to do to say, here's how we're going to make sure this trial is representative, laying out their plans, their approaches, how they base their decisions. So obviously this is brand new. There's I think a few that have started to come into the FDA, but we'll be kind of seeing over the next few years how these go, how they work, what sponsors are doing, how FDA is reacting. But definitely kind of the biggest impetus to change here that we've seen recently with FDA having new authority to kind of expect and require these plans from sponsors. The sponsors are not going to want their programs to be held up because FDA is not happy with their efforts to be inclusive. Also, in recent years, Congress has passed legislation requiring Medicaid programs here in the States to cover routine trial costs associated with qualifying trials. This adds to older legislation from the Affordable Care Act that requires private payers to do similar. So now most people in the States at least should have most routine costs associated with trials. So this is, normal care visits and things like that. There are plenty of other, to Andrea's points earlier, costs associated with accessing and participating in trials that still need to be addressed. I mentioned the National Academy's report on improving representation in clinical trials and research that came out last year. Also, earlier this year, our friends at the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative released recommendations for improving diversity in clinical trials and a corresponding maturity model for research stakeholders to use. And many other stakeholders in the space, from sponsors, journals, and some payers, have engaged in efforts as well to various success. And I should also note here, within the past few months, the WHO released a draft guideline on good clinical trial practice that includes a lot of content on the importance of conducting inclusive representative trials, including kind of global considerations and making sure big international trials kind of reach across the globe. So it'll be interesting to see how that guideline from WHO kind of affects the broader conversation. Next slide. Before I hand it over to Sandra, I'm going to briefly introduce some work that we've been doing. And Andrea mentioned this at the top. A lot of the slides you've seen here came from some work we've been doing over the past year, interviewing expert stakeholders, doing some landscape assessments, and we had a public meeting earlier this summer in July. I think there's a link at the end of the deck to a recording of that. And so from that, we've gotten a series of recommendations and thoughts that I'm going to hand it to Sandra to dig in on in more detail. Sandra, over to you.
Thanks, Trevan, and thank you all so much for allowing us the opportunity to come and speak a little bit about our work with you today. So in our ongoing research and engagement, we've observed a multitude of initiatives, ideas, and a strong commitment to enhancing representation. However, we've also noticed a significant absence of coordination and accountability, resulting in redundant and sometimes conflicting endeavors that really hinder overall progress. Collaboration fosters the exchange of best practices, shared goals, and the development of inclusive policies, ultimately enhancing the quality and relevance of clinical research. It's through this unified effort that we can aspire to bridge gaps in health outcomes, reduce disparities, and pave the way for a more equitable and effective healthcare system that benefits individuals from all walks of life. So the aim of our ongoing research is to eliminate existing obstacles and areas ripe for improvement. We really seek to call upon relevant stakeholders to acknowledge their pivotal roles in driving representation and to outline strategies for collaboration. Ultimately, what we envision is a clinical trial system that is both seamless and representative, where we address systemic equity barriers while ensuring trials are integrated across diverse healthcare settings and contexts, making them accessible to all. Next slide, please. In the world of clinical research, there's a lot of different groups involved, including funders, sponsors, CROs, research institutions, investigators, patient advocacy groups, and more. And making clinical research representative isn't a job for just one group. It's something all stakeholders need to tackle together because of the pivotal role they all play in different parts of the clinical trial enterprise. The linchpin of this collaboration is accountability. Progress hinges on stakeholders being comfortable holding one another accountable, whether through formal contracts or the alignment of shared goals. Regardless of the form it takes, accountability is essential for meaningful progress, fostering a culture of openness and teamwork for the greater good of inclusive and representative clinical research. Next slide, please. To support a framework of accountability, the initial stage of our work involved identifying pivotal steps various stakeholders can take towards driving action and accountability. Our first call to action is directed at regulators. We advocate for the mandatory inclusion of diversity action plans in all submitted trials. Regulators have a unique opportunity to be at the forefront, providing resources to guide the creation of high-quality plans. Regulators also have a responsibility to educate the public on clinical research, ensuring resources are culturally and linguistically considerate. Turning our focus to industry stakeholders, our plea is for support in creating sustainable clinical research ecosystems. By broadening our reach to local and community sites, we can enrich the diversity of participants. To support this, industry leaders could develop and adhere to high-quality diversity action plans, using post-market research to address any identified gaps. For NIH and non-industry funders, we propose a powerful incentive: enforceable enrollment plans. NIH holds the authority to compel sponsors to align their plans with demographics and disease burden. The consideration of penalties for noncompliance can serve as a catalyst for meaningful change. We also propose that NIH mandates the formulation of enrollment plans as a prerequisite for funding, ensuring early engagement with local and disease communities across every phase of clinical trials. Next slide, please. Next on our list are policy and research-oriented nonprofits. These groups have the propensity to stand as beacons of progress, conducting research to establish best practices for data collection and evaluation. Their commitment can extend to engaging the broader stakeholder community and communicating findings in easily digestible formats. It's really about making research accessible and collaborative, particularly for the groups that contribute to the research findings. Turning our focus to journals, we envision a transformative step, a scoring metric that reports how well published trials meet representation expectations. We advocate for a policy mandating authors to disclose anticipated representation and any deviations in final trial populations, ultimately empowering readers with a comprehensive understanding of the inclusivity of research. Next on our list are health systems and providers. We urge active support for a diverse workforce trained in clinical research principles. By fostering sustainable research ecosystems that reflect the communities that they serve and creating systems that raise awareness among potential trial participants, we empower communities and drive inclusivity. Finally, in the sphere of ethical oversight, institutional review boards play a critical role. We propose that representation expectations and community engagement be an integral part of IRB reviews, supporting a future where community-based reviews drive research, ensuring resources are directed towards areas that matter the most to local and disease communities. Collectively, these actions create a framework that not only demands accountability, but propels us towards a future where clinical trials are truly representative. Next slide, please. In wrapping up our discussion on navigating equity challenges within clinical trials, it's really important to emphasize that confronting structural racism in the healthcare system and fostering robust community engagement is essential. These elements are not just considerations, they are the linchpins for achieving truly inclusive clinical trials. Our journey has shown us that by uniting stakeholders across the clinical trial enterprise, we build a collective strength and encourage meaningful progress. To ensure accountability in this endeavor, we propose strategic investments and coordinated efforts within a robust policy framework. It's through intentional collaboration and shared initiatives that we pave the way for a future where clinical trials authentically mirror the diverse tapestry of our population. Thank you for your engagement and dedication to advancing equity in healthcare for all.
Thank you all for an incredible deep dive into what equity and access means. As we wait to see, actually, we do have a question in our chat. Let's hear from Taiwo Adebulu. He is joining us from Nigeria today. Taiwo.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's afternoon here in Nigeria. Yeah, my question has to do with the devastating Kano Pfizer trial of 1996. I've been to Kano State, northern Nigeria, which is in the Sahel region. And that's the region where we have most rare diseases or most infectious diseases being recorded across sub-Saharan Africa. So in my field work to those communities, I realized that they do not want any vaccination. They do not want any new drug that could treat some of the diseases that they are battling with. And that is because they've experienced the Pfizer trial of 1996 that killed thousands of women, thousands of children. And so, with this kind of distrust, how do we make these drugs accessible to people who really need them in the northern Nigeria, where most of these diseases are being recorded? So, how do we quench the distrust in some of these clinical trials, having experienced firsthand their children being used as guinea pigs?
Yeah, Taiwo, thank you very much for that question. So I think what you're highlighting in particular too is that these types of whether they're called structural racism or not in all of these countries and across the world, right? Every country has experienced some form of historical mistreatment. However, I do want to highlight too that it's not just historical, it's also contemporary. And I think, and that's what a lot, at least in the US, we've been trying to reckon in terms of, it's not just the historical events, but also the contemporary examples of discrimination that and structural racism that continues to create this mistrust among community members. I will say this is where I think that building or viewing it more or identifying strategies that get at the trustworthiness of health systems is one way to address this. It takes time though, and I think that is very difficult, but it is about at least what we are doing at Duke, and not just at Duke-Margolis, but we have a number of initiatives, again, just taking the Duke experience, we have a number of initiatives within Duke right now to increase the university's trustworthiness among populations that actually live very close to Duke, but have been historically and contemporarily discriminated through when seeking services to the health system. And so some elements include, like, for example, this type of community engagement that I was discussing of, building relationships, first understanding what are the key reasons, beyond this 1990, or in addition to this 1996 trial that occurred, what are the other elements that may be factoring into the mistrust? But then it's also important for the, in the case of Nigeria, I think too, of the government, along with, within that, like the regulators, and also, other people involved in the clinical trial infrastructure to really be engaging community-based organizations and others. I would love to hear your thoughts too of what you think is feasible, but that is one approach that has worked within local communities here in the US. Again, though, it does take a lot of time, and I think acknowledging that there have been these historical mistreatments, but acknowledging that it is also contemporary examples as well is also an important step.
Manuela Calari of Italy has a question next.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentations. I wanted to ask whether you could add a little bit more about how clinical trials for rare disease therapy differ from typical clinical trials, beside the number of participants, if there's anything, any difference, and also how all that you have said about accessibility translate into those clinical trials for rare disease treatments, or if you have numbers on statistics specifically for clinical trials on rare diseases, or if you can tell us where we can find those numbers, those statistics. Thank you.
Yeah, I can try to take that one. And this will be dependent, obviously, on a disease by disease basis, because rare disease encompasses quite a lot. But it's often a case where they're diseases that have not been as studied because they're so rare. So we often don't have really clear endpoints that we know are valid and work. So it's kind of two pieces. It's the smaller study part, and it's finding kind of the right endpoints to make sure whatever therapy in question is really making an effect. So, for example, I think the sickle cell CRISPR-based drug that's kind of in the news right now, I think looked at levels of a certain type of protein in the blood that is driving the change in outcomes, but there's not necessarily a longer term endpoint yet on kind of what these patients will look like years down the line. So we can say now we're seeing this change in these patients with increased oxygen in the blood, or this increased protein that kind of is improving kind of how they feel in the short term. But I suspect, at least, that FDA and other regulators will require additional follow-up in the coming years to make sure that A, the change is lasting, and B, that that these patients continue to feel better and improve. So many rare diseases have situations like that where we try to find some biomarker in the interim to say, here we are making this change with this therapy, and then there was a need for longer term follow-up to say, are patients surviving longer? Are the results durable? This is often common in some of the muscular degeneration diseases where the gene therapies where we give them to patients young. We might see some effects for the first year or two, and then there remains questions like, how long will this last? In these children, will it be a durable response? And so there's a need for follow-up there. In terms of numbers and statistics, I'm sure there are resources out there. They're not coming to top of mind for me right this morning. So I can try to look into that, maybe Rachel, and send you a quick note if I'm able to dig a good resource out. But generally, I think the takeaway is they tend to be smaller. They tend to be often focused, particularly for rare diseases that are not had a long history of research, on more intermediate biomarker-based endpoints. And then there's continued work to kind of follow along and make sure, particularly in the gene therapy related space, that results are durable. Yes, Karen, thank you in the chat. This is that's a common approach right now from the FDA for a lot of these cell and gene therapies, is 15 years of follow-up to make sure that we kind of know how these therapies are going long term. So thanks for that fact as well. Hopefully that answered most of your question.
Megan Holohan of Today has a question.
Hi, thank you all. I wanted to piggyback off of that question about clinical trials. Several years ago, I wrote about families of children with Niemann-Pick type C, and they had a clinical trial that showed no difference whenever they had the drug intervention. But then when compared to natural history, there was a difference in their symptoms. Is there an appetite on the part of the FDA to innovate when it comes to clinical trials with rare diseases because of the limitations these populations often face?
I think there is an appetite, at least in parts of the FDA. You can go and find Peter Marks, the director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at FDA, has said a lot about what he is interested in doing to drive innovation for cell and gene therapies, kind of across the board. Now, it's a tricky balance, right? Because if there's something that's going to help patients, I think FDA is very interested in getting that to those patients, but they want to make sure it's safe and effective. And so that kind of risk benefit calculation is always, heavy on FDA's mind, but they see the needs from these patient communities for new approaches, and are definitely interested in doing what they can as regulators to promote innovation while making sure what they do approve is still safe and effective for patients. And I think actually a year or so ago, I'm trying to find a link really quick. We hosted a meeting on Niemann Pick specifically here at the center. So I can find that link in the next 5 minutes. I'll drop that in the chat.
Andrea is putting some very important tips for the journalists in the chat, and that is the focus on community health workers. When I lived in Kenya, and right before I left, there was a huge push on policy levels to try to provide education for community health workers, certification for them, and truly empowering them to do a lot of the sort of heavy lifting about going into communities and saying, here's the importance of vaccination, and here's why you should participate in the malaria trials, et cetera. So I think all of you in all of your countries should perhaps maybe look into that as a way to create stories and content that might elevate that issue. I wanted to put a question.
Rachel, do you mind just
sure,
elaborating on that? Sorry for interrupting. So I just wanted to make that point, and I guess so Taiwo, responding to your original question too, but tying into so some of the work that I'm doing right now, not related to rare diseases, but is in the same realm, I guess, if you will, is in increasing insurance enrollment among Latino populations in North Carolina. So again, right, it's building trust. It's explaining the importance, of the work that I'm doing, insurance, but in the case of what a community health worker could do, and in terms of explaining the importance of enrolling in a rare disease trial, receiving the vaccination, all of these steps. But that's where the role of community health workers can serve as a bridge. However, this is where the second link that I put in the chat, this is based on a project that I've been doing at Duke with a group called the Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics for Underserved Populations, which is a large NIH program for COVID-19 testing. Duke and UNC, as well as the Community Coalition of Partners for Health, are the coordinating center for this program. But one of the key lessons that came out of this work is the importance of community health workers to build that trust, whether it was to seek a COVID-19 test, a COVID-19 vaccine, or, in the case of here, right, seeking rare diseases. So again, a lot of the lessons that we've seen, and not just from the pandemic, community, there's lots of evidence across the world on the benefits of community health workers. But I do firmly believe that working with community health workers would be one way to overcome a lot of the barriers that we have. It's not the only solution, but it is really a foundational solution that's needed.
We are sadly running out of time, but I did want to put one question perhaps to Sandra based on her presentation. And that is, I'm wondering, in this current environment in the US specifically, that is sort of a backlash to diversity and equity. And anytime those words are uttered, there's often a strong sort of pushback. I'm wondering, in the realm of clinical trials and trying to increase representation, is there a similar sort of maybe resistance, or sort of a sense of don't force policies on us in the realm of science, and that our work is so busy, or so important rather, we can't take time to worry about diversity? What are you hearing in those circles?
That's a really great point. And I think especially after we had this sort of resurgence of the civil rights movement in the United States, we started to see a lot of sort of very reactionary equity and diversity related initiatives. And I think there was also sort of like a similar backlog of people that were also sort of reacting in a very negative, almost like sort of annoyed way to some of those initiatives. And as we were kind of conceptualizing this project, one of the things that we tried to think about was how do we make sure that we're not just sort of recapitulating or repeating what's already been said in a way that kind of makes people to shut down before we're even able to sort of communicate what we see as being some of those key findings or key insights. And that's one of the reasons we really decided to take this representation framing, where when you say diversity, that can mean a lot of different things. And because of the feelings and the perceptions that people may have around some of those initiatives, it immediately makes people shut down. But representation is more of sort of like an objective and reachable goal, because it's saying, we're not saying that you necessarily have to, if you're a smaller pharmaceutical company that may not have the resources to run a really big trial, include every type of person that exists within the United States. But what we're telling you to do is to make sure that the trials that you do run represent the people that are affected by this disease or condition the most. And I think that's one way to sort of get around some of that backlash, is by trying to be a little bit more clear and objective in the way that you really communicate those goals, so that it doesn't seem like something that's very nebulous or unreachable, but has like a very clear target for people to reach.
This presentation has done a brilliant job of giving us all a strong baseline on what to consider when we take on projects about diversity in clinical trials and what that means for rare diseases. So Andrea Thoumi, Trevan Locke, and Sandra Yankah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for inviting us.
Yeah, thanks all of you. This has been great.
I would like to ask three of you before you go about this event that's happening in December. Is that something that the journalists could log on?
Yes, the link I dropped should have a registration link open for anyone that wants to check it out. I don't think none of the three of us are directly involved in it. I just know that it's happening.
Describe it for us, Trevan, what it is.
So we have some collaborative agreements with the Food and Drug Administration. Part of our team does, and so the next event on the list there is advancing the development of therapeutics through rare disease patient community engagement. So this is something coming out of a requirement for FDA in that same legislation I mentioned, driving diversity action plans. And so I believe our team here is working with the FDA on a meeting to discuss approaches and opportunities for engaging patients, patient groups, and other stakeholders in the rare disease space to understand how patients living with these diseases and incorporate those experiences into drug development and regulatory review. So I hope it'll be a good meeting. Like I said, we have not been directly involved in it, but I believe on the link I sent, we have a draft agenda up and the ability to register for anyone that would like to do so.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we have your emails, and so the journalists, I'm sure, will be reaching out to all of you as well. So thank you so much.